It's worth stopping to unpick what that actually means. It certainly sounds like this is a man gearing up to send British troops to Ukraine as part of a peacekeeping effort if, and it is an if still, if a deal is struck to end the war. Now, if Ukraine really is the front line of Britain, well, that means we're on the front line with Russia, which means we could be in a position where British troops are fighting Russian troops without potentially the protection of NATO. Now, that feels to me, frankly, unlikely. And there's another potential issue as well. A peacekeeping force can't just be decided on by Ukraine. You know, Russia would presumably need to have a say too over the composition of any peacekeeping force. Who might they insist on? China? North Korea? You know, my sense is that for all the rhetoric about Ukraine being the front line of Britain and the UK playing its full part in any peacekeeping efforts, some kind of backup military support sitting behind the actual front line feels far more likely. But, you know, this is just one of the many questions to be worked out by European leaders alongside Ukraine, the US and Russia. But the one thing that there does seem to be agreement on is the need for Europe to spend more on defence. Here's Keir Starmer today.
Well, we have to spend more on defence. That's the reality of the situation we find ourselves in. That's why we made a commitment to 2.5%. We are going through a strategic review of defence at the moment, which is looking at the challenges and the capability, and then we'll set out that path. But part of my message to our European allies is that we've all got to step up on both capability and on spending and funding. That includes the UK, which is why we've made that commitment to spend more.
So that's what Keir Starmer was saying, and it is also one of those rare occasions where there's agreement across the political divide too, with Kemi Badenoch also calling for more defence spending.
Totalitarian states like Russia, Iran and North Korea are coordinated in their efforts. Failing to spend more on defence is not peacemaking, it is weakness, and it only emboldens their threats to democracy and global stability.
You know, here's the thing when it comes to defence spending. There's an awful lot of talk about the need to spend more. There's an awful lot less talk about exactly what they want to spend those extra billions on. And there's not very much talk at all on what spending we're prepared to cut in order to do so. All of those things need to be worked out. Now, we're still awaiting to hear from Keir Starmer at that conference in Paris. He's speaking, of course, to his European allies. But as we await that, we can go to our political correspondent, Amanda Akas, who's in Downing Street for us now. Amanda, what are we expecting to hear?
Well, we're fairly clear on what Sir Keir Starmer was planning to say to the other European leaders at that summit, which has just finished, because he told us in advance. He announced today that he was prepared to put British troops on the ground as part of a peacekeeping force in the event of a peace deal being reached, although he made it clear that he thought it was important that the US was still a critical part of any such security guarantees for Ukraine. He also made the point that that was important to ensure that any peace deal was lasting and just, that it wasn't just some kind of opportunity for a pause in the fighting, which would allow the Russians to go away and regroup and attack again. As we heard from him just then as well, he's very much been echoing the lines that we've heard from Donald Trump and his team in the White House this week about the need for all of Europe to spend more on defence, to step up and take more of the burden of its own defence, rather than relying on the US. And he has reiterated that commitment that he made before the general election for the UK to increase defence spending from 2.3% to 2.5%. So he's hoping to hear echoing commitments, I think, from the Europeans at this summit. We know that French President Emmanuel Macron has previously suggested that the French would be willing to take part in some kind of peacekeeping operation as well. It's unclear as to whether any of the other countries will also be making similar commitments. In terms of the numbers, that's pretty unclear as well. President Zelensky previously talked about needing around 200,000 soldiers. The size of the British Army at the moment is only around 80,000. Downing Street didn't really want to get drawn into those numbers when asked about that earlier. But it's also important to point out about this spending commitment on defence. We still don't know when they're going to hit that target of 2.5%. They've commissioned a review into defence spending, which is still going on. They still won't say exactly when it's going to be published. Presumably they're going to have to do some rapid re-editing considering what's been happening in Europe over the past few weeks. But they've told us that will be published in the spring, and then it'll be up the Chancellor to make an announcement. There's a lot of pressure to increase defence spending. It's going to cost at least £5 billion just to get to that 2.5%. Many military chiefs, of course, warning that we need to go much further if we're going to actually have an effective peacekeeping force deployed on the ground, and for other military interventions as well, potentially. Donald Trump, of course, wants to see NATO members spending 5% on defence. But of course, we also know government spending is under huge pressure. Already it looks like the Chancellor's likely to have to make some big cuts to government spending during the next spending review. They've pledged not to put up most taxes already, and under her self-imposed fiscal rules, there won't be more borrowing to pay for day-to-day spending as well. So some very difficult choices ahead for the government, but we know that tonight Sir Keir Starmer adamant that defence spending will increase in the UK, and he says he's prepared to get troops on the ground in Ukraine.
OK, Amanda, thank you very much indeed. Well, as Amanda was just saying, there are some big questions to be answered about defence spending and also European security. The Prime Minister says we have to increase the military budget, but there's still no timeline for the 2.5% of GDP target. And the other big question, can the country afford it? Our security and defence editor Deborah Haynes reports.
The relentless brutality of Russia's war. Here, Ukrainian soldiers on the counter-attack. This is a front line that could become frozen in any ceasefire deal, with foreign forces potentially brought in to keep the peace. British troops like these could be among them. They have expertise in commanding operations, but no longer much capacity.
What is lacking are the teeth, the sinews of war, the capabilities, the people, and this requires significant numbers of people. For example, if Britain was to sign up to providing some 10,000 troops for this, that would actually mean 30,000.
The last time the UK deployed forces at any kind of scale was to Afghanistan. But keeping 10,000 soldiers on the ground requires another 10,000 to be resting back home and a third 10,000 to be preparing to deploy. Today, Britain would likely struggle to muster a force half that size to help uphold any ceasefire. While Keir Starmer is talking about the possibility of sending British troops here to Ukraine, defence insiders say he needs a reality check. The armed forces have been hollowed out over decades, and sources tell me unless the Prime Minister quickly increases defence spending to a minimum of 2.5% of GDP, which amounts to an extra £5 billion a year, he faces the prospect of new big cuts to the military. Speaking at a security summit in Munich over the weekend, the Ukrainian president signalled any foreign peacekeeping force would need to comprise at least 110,000 troops. A huge undertaking for the UK and its European allies, unless the US also plays a part.
It's a heck of a lot cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one. And I think what's more important than the 2.5 or 2.65 debate that I read about going on here in the UK is what kind of force do you want to have? And what you need is a military force that can operate for sufficient duration and an ample scale to prevail in a conflict.
The hope, of course, is that if an international force is sent to Ukraine, it would never have to fight. But the soldiers would need Russia to believe that they could and fight to win. Deborah Haynes, Sky News, Lviv, Western Ukraine.
Well, in the last few moments, Sir Keir Starmer has been speaking in Paris after those talks with European leaders. Let's have a listen.
Good evening. I want to thank President Macron for convening us this evening. At stake is not just the future of Ukraine, it is an existential question for Europe as a whole, and therefore vital for Britain's national interest. This is a once-in-a-generation moment for the collective security of our continent. Only a lasting peace in Ukraine that safeguards its sovereignty will deter Putin from further aggression in the future. Now, recent statements by the US administration should not come as a surprise. President Trump has long expressed the wish for Europe to step up and meet the demands of its own security, that he wants to get a lasting peace agreement to end the war in Ukraine. So today's informal meeting of European leaders was a vital first step in responding to that challenge. On defence, it's clear the US is not going to leave NATO. But we Europeans will have to do more. The issue of burden sharing is not new, but it is now pressing. And Europeans will have to step up, both in terms of spending and the capabilities that we provide. On Ukraine, we're at the very early stage of the process. Europe must play its role. And I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again. So I will go to Washington next week to meet President Trump and to discuss what we see as the key elements of a lasting peace. I spoke to President Zelensky on Friday and will do so again in coming days. And we envisage a further meeting with European colleagues when I return from the US. In this moment, we have to recognise the new era that we are in, not cling hopelessly to the comforts of the past. It's time for us to take responsibility for our security, for our continent. And I've been clear today, Britain will take a leading responsibility, as we always have, because Ukraine must have a secure future, Europe must have a secure future, Britain must have a secure future, and democratic values must prevail. Thank you. I'll now take a question, I think, first from Sky and then to Reuters. Sky.
Prime Minister, by unilaterally starting talks with Russia, has the United States undermined the UK, Europe and Ukraine?
What the United States wants is lasting peace. That's what Ukraine wants. That's what the United Kingdom wants. And that's what European allies want. What is important is that we ensure that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position if we're to go into talks or if the fighting is to continue. And to ensure that if there's discussion about any guarantees that are being provided, that the European nations show willing, as I have done, but also are absolutely clear that it must be with a US backstop, because I don't believe it'll be a guarantee if there isn't the US backstop behind those security guarantees. Thank you.
What sort of future do you see for any Ukraine peace deal if the United States will not guarantee to put troops on the ground?
Well, look, we're at a very early stage of the discussions at the moment. The war is going on, and the quickest way to end the war is, of course, for Russia to cease its aggression. So this is the very early stages. I do think that it's right that European nations, including the UK, show a willingness to do more in our own collective self-defence. This is a generational moment for that reason. This is not a new issue. It's an issue we've talked about many, many times, about the need for Europeans to step up. This is the moment to do so, including, if necessary, security guarantees. But they must be part of a package with US backing, because otherwise I don't think they will operate effectively as guarantees, because they won't be an effective deterrence. And that's why I'm so clear on this point. That's what we want to talk to our colleagues about in Europe. That's what I've been talking to President Zelensky about. Of course, that'll inform my discussions with President Trump. But we're all aligned on what we want to achieve here, which is lasting peace, not a ceasefire that allows Putin to come back again, but lasting peace. And I think that's where there's real alignment, and what we're now doing is discussing how we take that forward. Thank you. I'll go to Reuters, if I may.
Just to follow up on the US question, what in your eyes would be a US backstop? What would that mean?
Well, look, we're at a very early stage of the discussions at the moment, obviously. And the most important thing as we go into these discussions is to maintain the principle of peace through strength. And what I mean by that is making sure that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position. It'd be a big mistake to think that just because there may be talks, that now is the time to back down on any support for Ukraine. We need to ramp it up, in my view, and I've been saying that for many months now. What we also need to do is to ensure that if there is an agreement, it is a lasting and enduring and just agreement that secures the sovereignty of Ukraine, and that has to be at the heart of it. And then, of course, the question of security guarantees, and whether it's on security guarantees or the wider collective defence in terms of funding or capability. I think this is the moment for European countries to step up, and I am going to ensure the UK is a leading country in that endeavour.
And you said Britain would be ready to send peacekeeping troops with others. Has there been any initial planning in terms of how many troops would be needed for such a peacekeeping force, and what role would they play?
Well, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves here. The question is, the early stages of discussions, they haven't even started yet. But what is important is that clear, what is it we're trying to achieve? And that is a lasting peace, a peace that can endure, a peace that ensures that Ukraine has sovereignty, and that we are clear that this isn't just about Ukraine, it is about the defence and security of Europe and the defence and security of the United Kingdom. And so that's why I'm saying this is a generational moment, because it isn't just about what happens in Ukraine, it's what happens across Europe, it's what happens to the United Kingdom. And the first duty that I have as Prime Minister is to make sure that our citizens, our country, is safe and secure.
Keir Starmer there saying it's a once-in-a-generation moment for the security of Europe. He says that it's time to step it up in terms of funding and capability, and also that where it comes to support for Ukraine, now is the time to ramp it up. He also mentioned that he's prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there's a peace deal in Ukraine, but there must be, in his words, a US backstop. Right, let's talk now to our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, who joins us from those European talks in Paris. Adam, we heard you there asking a question to Keir Starmer. What's your summary of what's been happening?
Yeah, very interesting comments there from the Prime Minister here in the, this is the British Embassy in Paris, just a short walk away from the Elysée. So actually the Prime Minister walked to and fro those discussions, clearly pivotal in terms of framing the European response. And it comes at a time of flux. There is a sense across Europe that the actions, the comments and criticism from Donald Trump and his regime have not necessarily spurred them into action, but have definitely created a different dynamic, particularly, I think, three things. One was J.D. Vance's caustic speech in Munich. The second one was Trump having that long talk with Putin and effectively, unilaterally, this is the third element, starting peace deal, if we can put it like that, negotiations that don't involve Europe or Ukraine. So what has come out of this long meeting? And as a reminder, Keir Starmer was here, so was the French President, the German Chancellor, the leaders of Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Poland, Denmark, as well as NATO and the European Council and Commission. What has come out of this is clearly a resolve to act together, to pursue what the Prime Minister referred to there as a lasting peace. He said not simply a ceasefire, that a ceasefire would give Vladimir Putin a chance to come back again. But I think the most significant thing was this commitment that Europe will put troops on the ground, and we're very vague about what sort of peace deal this could be, but only if there is what he referred to as a backstop. Now, you will have heard him there being challenged about what exactly is meant by a backstop, and to be blunt, he didn't give an answer. But I think we have to assume that that is a significant military presence by the United States in order to try to ensure that whatever peace deal, peace agreement is put in place is firm enough and is backed up with enough troops that it would prevent Russia from once again attacking or attempting in any way to invade Ukraine. That goes against a lot of the rhetoric from the United States over the past week or so, which is about withdrawing troops from Europe and leaving the defence of Europe to European nations. Now, Keir Starmer here talked about a new era. And I think I've been hearing this from diplomats, and now we hear it from the Prime Minister. There's clearly a resolve to increase defence spending. It's clear that European authorities are going to change the rules to allow their members in the European Union to increase their defence budgets. I think that is happening. And you heard there Keir Starmer referring to this as a once-in-a-generation moment. So defence spending will increase. Europe, I think these leaders do accept that they need to do more to police their own continent. But at the same time, he is not naive, neither are any of these people. The United States military might dwarf that of any other member of NATO. It is naive, I think, at the moment to think that that European nations could hold back Russia if Russia determined to invade Ukraine without any support from the United States. That at the moment seems to be the red line that has been drawn, that the UK and probably other European nations will provide troops to back up some kind of peace deal, but they will insist that the United States rolls in along with them. And next week, Keir Starmer will be going to Washington to have that debate with the president, with Donald Trump. And he said that when he comes back from Washington, he's going to hold another meeting with European leaders to pass on what he's learned. And just, we should say, while this is happening here in Paris, in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, American and Russian officials are meeting to discuss the shape of what they consider to be a peace deal in Ukraine. Talks that do not include Europe nations, do not include Ukraine, and ones that President Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, has already said that he will reject because he does not accept any deal that does not involve Ukrainian participation.
Adam, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for explaining all that so clearly. Adam Parsons there for us. Well, let's bring in our duo for this evening, shall we? The former Conservative Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, and the Labour peer, Baroness Helena Kennedy. It feels like a very big night, actually, and I'm very glad to have you both here to kind of chew over what it all means. We had Donald Trump, I guess, throwing down the gauntlet to Europe, and here, the first sign of what that European response is. What do you make of it?
I don't think we should underestimate just how serious this is, because what the United States under Donald Trump is doing is actually reconfiguring their relationship and their status in the world and their relationship with Europe as a whole. And they are making it very clear that it's not going to be anymore that they are going to be available to come to the aid of Europe when it's under any kind of onslaught. And we are under an onslaught because there's no doubt that Putin has determined that he wants to have his own empire to match that of the unipolar situation that he made a great speech, you see, in 2007, saying, you know, basically making a challenge to the United States and saying, we've got this unipolar world where, you know, America rules everything, and it's not going to continue like that. And he's shown, and then, of course, you saw the taking of Crimea, nobody did anything, and now we're seeing the business of Ukraine. And I actually do think this is serious, this is really serious. And when the ask is being made that the United States has to show that it is going to back up Europe, that Europe, yes, they'll rise to the occasion and perhaps not not too soon, should be having more money spent on defence and doing that without having to always turn to America. But so that demand is a reasonable one. But what's not reasonable is to say, and we're doing nothing to help you in this particular situation. So the ask of America is a big one. And I think that America has to be saying to the Putin and to Russia, you know, what are you putting on the table? You're asking Ukraine to surrender its right to join NATO. You're asking Ukraine to surrender land. What are you going to put on the table? And it has to be helping them rebuild their country. It has to be promises of absolute security. And there has to be a return of all the children. It's one of the things that I've been involved in relation to the war crimes that have taken place. And the line has to be that if you don't do that and there's any breaches of it, we will give Ukraine all the arms they need to deal with you.
Look, I think what Helena said is absolutely right. And this is a completely new situation we're in. Many of us, certainly older viewers, we grew up with the Cold War. And the assumption there with the Soviet Union was that whatever happened, America, the US, would underwrite our defence. And to people like Trump, it was essentially almost like a blank cheque. And what he's done is ripped that blank cheque up. What I find extraordinary is that he hasn't really engaged with allies. He said, look, I'm going to deal with Putin. We're going to go to Saudi Arabia. You guys aren't going to be part of the conversation. The Ukrainians won't be part of the conversation.
That's extraordinary.
And he's just gone ahead on his own. And what we're seeing is European leaders really scrambling to play catch-up. But they don't know what the deal is. And none of us know what the deal is. So it's very disruptive. And to be fair to Trump, he's been saying this for years. He's been saying, you guys have been living off the fat of the land. You've been, taking advantage of us.
This goes further. This actually goes further, I think.
It does, but all I'm saying is that he's been beating this drum for a very long time.
Can I ask you, as a former Chancellor, how difficult is it going to be for the UK to find more money for defence spending?
It's going to be very hard. Yeah. And actually, the 2.5%, I mean, the debates within Whitehall, we were always committed to 2.5%. I think Rishi Sunak said that. But it was, when would that 2.5% kick in? And the Treasury, I think, was assuming that maybe 2030, we could inch our way up to the 2.5%. But it's very clear from what Trump and others are saying that we're going to have to get to the 2.5% much earlier.
And that's going to mean really hard decisions, right?
And that means that you're quite right. So if you're aiming to get to the 2.5% by 26, 27, those years, it'll cost a lot more money, and you're going to have to find the money. You can't borrow anymore because you've got the fiscal rules. And I'm afraid there's going to have to be some sort of restraint on spending.
I mean, I'm sure that the Prime Minister is saying that, when he's talking about boots on the ground, he's not talking about, us joining in to a war. I don't think that's on his mind at all. But he's imagining that there will be troops coming from any number of countries, particularly those that are really at risk and so on. I mean, that there's going to be a presence made up of a combination of people. But what they need is America to be saying, and you Putin, break the rules, and we will come after you. We will give Ukraine everything it needs to... Remember, we've got to remember that in this war, Ukraine has actually operated on a basis of restraint, I suspect because of America not giving it the right kind of weaponry and so on. It has never bombed Moscow in any kind of real way. It's never gone in there so that you have a sort of mutuality in the terms of... It's basically operated in a defensive position because of what the West was expecting.
But they did invade Kursk. I mean, they have done some offensive
but it's
operations.
been pretty defensive on the whole.
I think you're right on the whole.
And that's because of the constraints that the United States and Europe has put on it in terms of weaponry. And I think that you have to promise the weaponry will be there for you, and you have to also say, we'll go after your money that's in banks, Mr. Putin.
You also need... So the issue that I think needs American involvement is the boots on the ground. I mean, Zelensky's talking about 110,000. There's no way Europe can get anywhere near that.
I could genuinely talk about this for so many more hours from both of you. But we do need to be... It's really interesting. Thank you very much for giving your opinions there. Well, earlier, I did speak to the former Foreign Office Permanent Under-Secretary, Sir Simon Fraser. Let's have a listen. Thank you very much for being on the programme. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
So, Trump and Putin are negotiating over Ukraine. It feels a little bit like Europe's playing catch-up.
Yeah.
What do you think needs to happen in Paris?
Well, they aren't yet negotiating, but they say they're going to negotiate. So let's see what happens in Riyadh. But clearly what's happening here is that the Europeans are playing catch-up. They've been taken by surprise by the announcement of these negotiations and then, of course, by the tone of Vice President Vance's speech in Munich. They've been shocked by that. Although, frankly, they shouldn't have been surprised because the signals have been there for quite a while. And now they're now reacting. And not surprisingly, they want to be at the table in any negotiation. And what they're realising is that if you want to be at the table, you've got to put something on the table. And that's what this meeting in Paris is about, really. Hence the talk of increased defence spending. Hence Keir Starmer's suggestion that he's ready to put British troops on the ground if necessary. That's the reaction to the shock that they've had.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpick here, isn't there? But you say there about Keir Starmer hinting that he may be willing to put troops on the ground. And I'm just, I guess, trying to get my head around that. You know, are we really talking about a situation where British forces could be fighting against Russian forces?
No, what he's talking about is in a situation when there has been a negotiated settlement of some sort, and it's a decent one, which we have confidence in, putting some British forces in alongside others in order to provide reassurance for the future sort of maintenance of that agreement. But we're a long way away from that.
It's quite risky, that, right?
It's potentially very risky, and it would depend on the nature of the deal. It would also, in my view, depend on the Americans being prepared to underpin that deal themselves. So it's not just the British, but what he's indicating is that he wants to be part of this process. And I'm not surprised because, frankly, a lot of our interests are at stake here. This is about the security of Europe.
Yeah, you say they're about, you know, the Americans perhaps underpinning something, but it feels like, at least if you believe what Donald Trump is saying, that they're not that happy to do that.
Well, no, he has said that he's not going to put American troops on the ground, but there are all sorts of other things that the United States can do. After all, it's the United States that's negotiating the deal. The United States has a stake in that deal being good and being maintained. So I think they've got to uphold it.
What do you make of, you know, what Donald Trump has said so far? He's effectively saying, like, Europe needs to step up, you can't rely on America. Does that mean that we need to hug Europe a bit more tightly?
Well, something really important has happened, which is that the American security guarantee for Europe is less certain than it was before, and it's clearly more conditional than it was before, and we've got to react to that. Now, the issue for Britain is we're out of the EU, so we have some sort of tactical freedom in our foreign policy, but we've got to manage those two big relationships, one with America and one with Europe. And Keir Starmer is saying we can be a bridge between the two, but my concern is that that may not be the case because we don't really necessarily have enough purchase on either end of that bridge to be a really influential player. So we need to think about that very carefully, work out case by case where our interests lie and how we can manage the relationships. Not going to be easy, that.
What's your sense? What would you be advising?
Well, I would be advising that, you know, where we can take advantage, for example, of regulatory freedoms to advance the growth agenda, which is so important to this government, we should certainly consider doing that. But equally, our security interests are very closely aligned with those of other Europeans in the end, and that's going to be very important as well. So my question is, how do you hold those things in balance? That's going to be the challenge.
How seriously do you think we should be taking what Donald Trump has been saying? You mentioned J.D. Vance as well. How seriously do you think we should be taking it?
Well, we should take very seriously the fact that this is a different American administration that's going to conduct American affairs in a different way, based on power, economic power, military power and political power, not based on rules and principles, which is the way that we're used to running international affairs. We've got to adapt to that. We need to take that seriously. Now, equally, there is an element, I didn't, particularly appreciate the Vance speech. I thought it was pretty unpalatable in many ways, but there is an element of truth in the sense that we in Europe need to think about how we are dealing with the issues that are generating populist, anti-establishment movements in our countries. That is economic disadvantage, it's immigration. We can't just sweep them under the carpet. We've got to be able to respond to them.
What did you find unpalatable about his speech, then?
Well, I found very difficult the way that he was accusing European countries of not having freedom of speech, for example. He was more critical of his European allies than he was of Russia or China. And, of course, we are democracies and we do have open societies and we're proud of them. So that was the bit I found difficult to stomach.
A big part of this as well is defence spending.
Yeah.
Do we need to spend more on defence?
We do. We've known that for a long time. We've talked about it. It's really difficult because of the other pressures on the government spending, and Rachel Reeves was always very concerned about that. But again, my point is, you've got to get to the table, you've got to deserve to be there, and that is why there's so much talk of increasing European defence spending, and we're going to have to do it. We have to be able to stand up for ourselves collectively. That means more spending and better coordination.
Yeah, that's it, though, better spending, isn't it? Because it feels to me like an awful lot of people talk about more spending, but there's not much on what we're going to spend it on. You know, it reminds me a bit about the NHS debate, right? You know, where we're talking about spending more on the NHS without a conversation about how we're spending the money. So it feels like you kind of chuck it into a bottomless pit.
Well, there's a long history of sort of procurement issues in British defence spending, for example. There are rivalries between the different services. But then if you look across Europe, you have things like 2 separate future fighter jet programmes, one being led by the British and Italians, the other by the French and the Germans. Can we really afford that sort of luxury now? Surely we've got to align more closely on the production of major programmes for our defence industry.
That's interesting. I mean, there has often been talk, and I know this is going further than what you're saying, of like, you know, a European army.
Yeah.
I guess you'd stop short of that, would you?
Well, I don't think we need a European army, but we need better coordination of European armies and also European defence industry. And one of the issues for Britain is how much of that's going to be done within the European Union and what role are we going to have in all that? That's very important for us to get right.
And what do you think, how do we get that right?
Well, I think we need to talk, we need to be on the front foot there and be coordinating with other Europeans. But of course, also, we have an important defence relationship with the United States, and there's value in maintaining that as well.
You see, and you touched on this about, you know, the difficulty for the Chancellor, because, you know, we're in a situation where we spend more on debt interest than we do on schools, where councils are going bust, where rape victims are waiting years for justice because of a backlog in the courts. You know, a lot of people will be thinking, do we have to accept that we just can't spend the money on defence that we'd like to?
Well, that is a real problem for the government because, of course, if they don't improve the National Health Service and all the things, the commitments they made, then they're going to find themselves in a difficult position in the next election. My point is that we really haven't had the debate in the country that we need to have about the security situation and how it's changing around us. We're a long way off having an honest debate about that. We've got to get into these trade-offs in a more serious way. That's a real problem for the government, really difficult. But you see Keir Starmer moving in that direction now, and I think it's necessary.
What kind of level of defence spending do you think is the right one?
Well,
Trump said 5% of GDP.
Trump said 5%, but America doesn't spend 5%. I think that clearly we've committed to 2.5 without putting a timeline on it. We need to move in that direction rapidly.
So we need a timeline as well.
And we need to make things happen as opposed to just talk about them. But I go back to the earlier point that you and I have both made, which is it's not just the number, it's what you spend it on, how efficiently you spend it, and how you coordinate that for effect on the ground with your allies.
OK, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, the battle of the right-wing parties. Exclusive polling for Sky News suggests the Conservatives are trailing Reform UK. Certainly grim reading for Kemi Badenoch. We'll hear just how worried the Conservative leader is. Welcome back. An exclusive Sky News poll conducted by YouGov has laid bare the challenge facing the Conservatives from Reform UK, because when it comes to trust, strength and clarity of purpose, they're now trailing Nigel Farage's party. Our Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates has been finding out why.
Just how much trouble are the Conservatives in? How much potential does Reform UK have? Sky News has new exclusive polling allowing us to take a deep dive. Right, start here. Back 10 years ago, when Nigel Farage led UKIP, remember that? People thought that he was just too toxic to ever become Prime Minister, that there might be a ceiling on his and UKIP support that's lower than the potential pool of Tory voters. But how has that picture changed? Now he's leading the new party, Reform UK. And there's a clever way to measure all of this, so follow me on this. This bar here is the UK electorate. Now, we asked how many people would definitely not vote for Reform, and 56% said that they would definitely not. And here's the thing, that's an almost identical figure to the 55% who said they would definitely not vote Tory. Now, what does that mean? That means that the potential pool of 44% of voters could vote Reform. It's almost the same as the 45% who could vote for the Tories. So it really doesn't seem from all of this that Reform UK have a ceiling any higher or lower than the Tories. Now, I want to compare and contrast a few specifics when putting the Tories side by side with Reform UK. Now, how do voters feel about the two-party brands? Well, look at this. Only 10% see Kemi Badenoch's Tories as strong. 61% view them as weak. But what about for Reform? Look at this. 31% see them as strong, more than the 27% that see them as weak. Let's do another one. Now look at this. Only 18% of voters say that they think the Conservatives have a clear sense of purpose under Kemi Badenoch, whereas 59% say they are unclear about what the Tories actually stand for. And now let's put that side by side with Reform, and 49% say there's a clear sense of purpose from Nigel Farage, Reform UK, whereas 24% say they're unclear about what that party stands for. And do voters trust either of the parties? Not very much. It's certainly a resounding no for the Conservatives. 11% say they're trustworthy, 65% untrustworthy. But when it comes to Reform UK, 19% trustworthy, 52% untrustworthy. Now, it's too early in this Parliament for parties to have much policy. We're judging and seeing voters judging them on vibe. But at the moment, almost every element of the vibe of Reform UK is more attractive to voters than Kemi Badenoch's Conservatives. Challenging times ahead for the Tories.
Some fascinating stuff there from Sam Coates about the challenges on the right. And actually the future of the right is being debated at Jordan Peterson's Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference today, which has the lofty ambition of relaying the foundations of our civilisation. Kemi Badenoch gave a keynote speech. She also spoke to our political correspondent, Serena Barker-Singh.
So your speech this morning chimed with some of the elements from J.D. Vance's speech last week. Do you agree with him that the threat is within? And do you think that underestimates Russia?
I don't think that he is saying it's either one or the other. I think that it's really important that we look after security both internally and externally. And that's what J.D. Vance was saying in his speech. And he is absolutely right to talk about what we do with our defence. We need to start doing a lot more on defence. We were spending...
How much more? How much into GDP?
Well, at the moment, we can't afford to do much more. We've got to change our economy around. In the Cold War, when we weren't actually fighting, we were spending about 4%, and we can't do that now. I remember being in Cabinet, seeing if we could get to 3% by 2030, and we couldn't make it work because we're paying so much on debt, so much on welfare, and we've got to rewire our economy so that we can look after our country and its people.
But now, with real threats in Europe, what number would that be? 2.5, 3%?
Well, we made a commitment, 2.5 by 2030, and we had a plan to get there. Labour scrapped that plan. So what are they going to do instead? We're not the government anymore. I'm the leader of the opposition, and my job is to hold the government to account. We want to see what Labour's plan is, because even that plan was the minimum, and they've scrapped that. So what are they going to do?
And just to continue on defence, you said Donald Trump was a force for good in the world, but Trump bringing Putin into the out in from the cold, potentially cutting out Ukraine in negotiations. Is that really a force for good?
Well, let's see what happens. I think it's still early days. President Trump looks like he's trying to end the war in Ukraine. Obviously, we are strong supporters.
But without Ukraine?
Well, we are strong supporters of Ukraine. We've always said that we are. When I was in government, that's what we did. We gave them money, we gave them arms. We need to make sure that we are on the right side of this. And President Trump is trying to do that. So let's wait and see. What I'm not going to do is rush to a judgment. Nothing has actually been settled. There are talks taking place. Let's see what President Zelensky said. These are very tricky times, and we will, of course, have concerns that this is done absolutely the right way.
And then lastly, this conference is about uniting the right, ideas on the right of politics. Sky News today has a poll that shows that Reform is seen as stronger and more trustworthy than the Conservatives. That's quite worrying for you, isn't it? It seems like the Conservatives are in decline, not Western values.
Well, what worries me is the fact that we just had a historic defeat last year. Conservatives lost more seats than ever before. And it's no surprise that the public aren't rushing back, because they need to see that the party is under new leadership. That is what I'm offering. And we need to make sure that we rebuild trust with the public, being an effective opposition, like I'm doing now, talking about what we do on defence, like we've done on education, where Labour have a disastrous bill. Look at what's happening with the budget. Businesses across the country are screaming at what's being done to them.
Do you think that's working? The polls are all in Reform's favour.
Polls are a snapshot. I remember in 2019, Conservatives were at 9% in July, and we won the election in December. So polls are a snapshot. It's not an election now. We need to make sure that when there is an election, the public see a credible and viable alternative to Labour, and that will be my party.
And you'll be the leader of Conservatives in the next election?
Yes.
Right, let's chat to Kwasi and Helena, shall we? It feels like an awful lot is being redrawn at the moment, including politics of the right. I mean, it's now the time for Reform and the Conservatives to do a deal.
I don't think it makes any sense for them to do a deal ahead of any election, simply because, they're independent parties. All I'd say about Reform is that, we were in power for 14 years. I was involved in that. We had a record, and Reform have done nothing. They're a clean sheet of paper. So naturally, I can see why people would gravitate towards them. The other thing that Sam said in the clip, Sam Coates, earlier, was that it's very, very early days. We've got 4 years, probably, maybe 4.5 years to the next general election. So what Kemi Badenoch has to do is just stick to her plan. I think it's very, very difficult. She's under huge pressure. And a lot of that pressure will be saying you've got to do something on Reform, you've got to merge with Reform, you've got to do deals with them. But what she has to do is just stick to her plan and articulate why she, Kemi Badenoch, should be the next Prime Minister. I think chasing Reform at the moment would be premature and I think counterproductive.
Is this all just great news for Labour, or actually Reform a problem for Labour as well?
The real pressure for Labour, of course, is emanating from the United States, but it's everywhere because the swing to the far right, and we really are seeing authoritarianism, becoming rather popular because of the nature of the issues that are concerning people about low income, about immigration, and so on. And those are often manipulated by authoritarians. And so the problem for Labour is going to be about not appeasing that, not joining in, not saying, oh, well, we've got to run in that race too, and then shifting over to policies which are really inimical to the traditions of... So I do think that, I really do think that some unpleasant stuff is going on here. All this business about really not... the ending in the United States of diversity and inclusion and calling it woke. It's about having societies which are doing good things for women, for people from minorities, for disabled people.
I get all of that, but in government, Labour have a real problem because a lot of their seats are in the so-called red wall, northern seats, seats in the Midlands, other places, where Reform are the main threat. And you can already see that in the Parliamentary Labour Party, where they've already got a caucus.
It certainly is.
Which is trying to deal with Reform.
It certainly is splintering in the UK as well.
From a North London point of view, I can see that you want to stop the anti-woke stuff.
Again,
but in other parts of the country,
I'm going to have to let you guys continue chatting about this in the ad break because we've got to go.
The centre is the place to win elections.
Still to come on the Politics Hub. With the US dominating the news agenda since Trump took office, we'll take a deeper look at the woman fielding questions about the flurry of activity stateside.
We're going to do this 100 times every day for the next 3 months.
Why have we agreed to this?
Raises many questions about many things.
Actually seeing people impacted, she was so upset.
It was powerful. They kind of couldn't believe they were being berated here.
Very much on my terms, I think was the subtext. News happens fast around Donald Trump.
It was a kind of wow moment.
Yeah, that's what it feels like, doesn't it?
It's Trump world, and we just live in it.
So, where next?
Follow Trump 100 wherever you get your podcasts.
Prime Minister Modi is the most popular politician in the country. He is expected to win his 3rd term in these elections.
Jubilation in the streets, while some emotional.
This is a political victory for Prime Minister Modi and his Hindu Nationalist Party, a promise fulfilled. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
He paid over $50,000 to traffickers to get him to America. Instead, he was kidnapped, tied up, and threatened by smugglers. A commando from the state force walks me through to a Mai Thai village on the front line.
Firing the civilian and they're burning our house.
We cross to the opposite side, held by the cookies.
When they fire, we have to retaliate.
Sky News, get the full story first. Companies like these are helping India in its trajectory to be a serious player in space exploration.
The enthusiasm is palpable. The young desire change.
These elections are a pivotal moment for the country's economic and political history. The concern here is that the public healthcare system is inadequate.
In a prayer, she's asking God to help understand what happened. I cannot carry on. God, help me. He says his world has crashed. Like him, there are scores of families searching for their loved ones.
Too often have families endured such tragedies for the negligence not only by the administration, but also by spiritual people in this country. Free, wherever you get your news. Even though it has few seats in Parliament, Kashmir is symbolic and very significant. It's often been called a nuclear flashpoint.
Well, it seems that every evening since Donald Trump re-entered the White House, what's happening stateside is very much setting the news agenda, including tonight. And there's one face who has quickly become very familiar to all of us, the White House Press Secretary, Caroline Leavitt. And it's fair to say, like much of the president's new team, she's really made a mark.
It's an honor to be here with all of you. A lot of familiar faces in the room, a lot of new faces. And President Trump is back, and the golden age of America has most definitely begun. There has never been a president who communicates with the American people and the American press corps as openly and authentically as the 45th and now 47th president of the United States.
Now, this is why I'm slightly obsessed, right? This is Caroline Leavitt with her young son during the election campaign. Now, get this, she returned to the campaign trail 4 days after giving birth. I can't even really get my head around what that means.
I mean,
4 days.
Think of the hormone surges that we had when we had our children.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, the idea that, well, you have to give it to her.
Look at her, 4 days after giving birth. I think I was like, you know...
We know you haven't given birth, but
No,
you're still in awe of going back to work after 4 days.
You don't have personal experience.
But-
yeah, I don't think
but
I'd
I
left the
think-
house.
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary, and she's very on message.
She is
you know,
very
the
on
golden
message.
age of America, all of that stuff, they're kind of programmed within an inch of their lives.
It does feel like it's this new rise of the right. She's very young. She's the youngest ever press secretary. I think 27. And very
She's
family.
lasted longer than certainly Scaramucci did.
That's a good point,
yeah,
actually.
He
she's
did 11
lasted
days.
it, yeah.
But look, I think you're right. I think he thinks that this is a revolution. He's going to bring in his people and they're going to change the world. And let's see
And
how
women
that
are going to
ends.
be back at work after 4 days.
Let's see how that concludes.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Thanks both very much indeed. It's been a really busy programme this evening.
Very
It's great to get your knowledge and expertise.
Interesting times.
It is certainly. Well, that is it from us tonight. But I'll see you tomorrow at 7. Up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah J. Mee. And then after that, of course, you've got The World with Yada Hakeem at 9 p.m.